A 69-year-old man grabbed a musket that hadn't fired a shot in decades, walked out of his house in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and joined a Union regiment of complete strangers in the middle of a battle that would become the bloodiest in American history. He wasn't a soldier. No uniform, no orders, no rank. He simply decided the fight was happening in his town and he was going to be part of it. He took 3 separate wounds that day and became a legend almost nobody outside serious Civil War history has ever heard of. That's strange enough on its own. But it's only the beginning of what soldiers on both sides actually lived through between 1861 and 1865. Moments so specific and so poorly explained by any textbook that they sound invented even when every detail is documented. This is every soldier's weirdest experience in the American Civil War, explained in the next 22 minutes. And some of it will be genuinely hard to believe actually happened. That man's name was John Burns, and his story is worth finishing before moving anywhere else because it sets up something that repeats across almost every weird experience soldiers had in this war. The line between civilian life and combat was thinner than anyone expected it to be. Burns was a veteran of the War of 1812, decades removed from any military service, running a shoe repair shop when Confederate troops occupied his town on the 1st day of July, 1863. Rather than hide in his cellar like most of his neighbors, Burns walked toward the sound of gunfire, found a Union colonel, and asked to be handed a rifle and ammunition. The colonel, understandably confused by an elderly civilian volunteering for combat, gave him a weapon anyway. Burns fought alongside the 150th Pennsylvania in the fields west of town, took a bullet in the arm, another in the leg, and a third that grazed his side, and survived all 3 well enough to be found by Confederate soldiers after the fighting moved past him. He told them he was an innocent bystander who had been struck by stray fire, and remarkably, they believed him and left him where he lay, rather than taking him prisoner. Abraham Lincoln met him weeks later during his visit to Gettysburg and reportedly found the old man's story as astonishing as everyone else did. What makes Burns's story stranger still is how little anyone actually knows about why he made the decision in the first place. He left no detailed explanation, no diary entry laying out his reasoning, nothing beyond the bare fact that a retired shoemaker in his late 60s looked at a battle unfolding in his own streets and concluded that watching from a cellar wasn't an option available to him. He became, almost overnight, a national symbol of civilian patriotism, and poet Bret Harte later wrote a widely circulated poem about him that cemented his place in American memory. But the man himself gave interviews after the war that were notably modest about the whole affair, describing it less as heroism and more as something that simply needed doing, which may be the strangest part of the story. A man capable of walking into one of the deadliest battles in American history seemed to view the decision afterward as barely worth discussing. Not every strange experience involved fighting. Some of the war's most bizarre moments happened in the brief windows when soldiers stopped trying to kill each other entirely. Along the Rappahannock River in Virginia during the winter of 1862 and 1863, Union and Confederate pickets stationed on opposite banks developed an entire informal trading economy that their officers mostly tolerated and occasionally tried, without much success, to shut down. Soldiers built tiny toy boats out of scrap wood, rigged small sails, and loaded them with coffee, sugar, or newspapers before pushing them across the current toward the other side. The opposing pickets would send the boats back loaded with tobacco, which was abundant in the South and scarce in the North, along with Southern newspapers that Union soldiers were curious to read. Men who had been shooting at each other days earlier were now sending handwritten notes back and forth on these boats, asking about the war's progress, trading insults good-naturedly, occasionally arranging brief unofficial truces so both sides could bathe in the river without fear of being shot at. It was against regulations. It happened anyway, up and down multiple rivers, for most of the war. Officers on both sides had genuinely mixed feelings about the practice. Some worried, reasonably, that soldiers exchanging friendly notes with the enemy would lose their willingness to fight when ordered to do so, and periodically issued orders banning the boat trading specifically for that reason. Other officers seemed to quietly tolerate it, recognizing that soldiers stuck in static winter positions for months at a time needed some outlet for the boredom and misery of camp life, and that a small trade in coffee and tobacco wasn't likely to meaningfully undermine anyone's willingness to fight when spring campaigning resumed. Soldiers' letters from this period describe an almost surreal double consciousness. Men who had killed each other in battles weeks earlier now sitting on opposite riverbanks, calling out friendly questions about home, baseball scores, and whether the other side's newspapers were telling the truth about how the war was actually going. Some soldiers survived injuries that should have killed them through pure mechanical improbability rather than any medical skill available at the time. At the Battle of Raymond in Mississippi in May 1863, a Union officer named Frank Armstrong was struck directly over the heart by a Confederate bullet, and by every reasonable expectation of the men standing near him, should have died instantly. The bullet had struck a thick deck of playing cards he carried folded inside his breast pocket, and the compressed paper absorbed enough of the impact that Armstrong survived with nothing worse than severe bruising and a story he apparently told for the rest of his life. He was far from the only documented case. Soldiers across both armies carried Bibles, hymnals, tin mirrors, and metal pocket watches, and the historical record includes multiple accounts of these ordinary objects, deflecting or absorbing fire that would otherwise have been fatal. Union chaplains occasionally use these stories in sermons to soldiers before battle, which tells you something about how quickly these near misses became part of the war's shared folklore, even while the war was still being fought. Other soldiers experienced something considerably darker and harder to explain: a documented pattern of men reporting accurate premonitions of their own deaths in the hours before battle. At Chancellorsville in May 1863, multiple soldiers in different regiments wrote letters or told comrades hours before the fighting began that they were certain they would not survive the day. Some of these men requested that their personal effects be sent home, gave away small possessions to friends, or wrote final letters to family with a specificity that unsettled the people around them. A significant number of these soldiers did, in fact, die in the fighting that followed. Historians studying this pattern have generally attributed it to a combination of accumulated battle experience, allowing veteran soldiers to accurately read tactical situations as unusually dangerous plain statistical probability given the scale of casualties in major engagements, and the simple psychological reality that soldiers facing likely death sometimes process that fear as certainty rather than anxiety. Whatever the explanation, soldiers on both sides took these premonitions seriously enough that officers occasionally reassigned men who reported them to safer positions when it was tactically possible to do so. One of the most frequently cited cases involved a Union soldier at Chancellorsville who reportedly approached his company commander the night before the battle, handed over a small bundle containing his watch, a ring, and several letters, and asked that they be sent to his wife because he would not be alive to do it himself. His commanding officer, according to accounts passed down through soldiers who witnessed the exchange, tried to talk him out of the conviction, pointing out that plenty of men felt exactly this kind of dread before a fight, and lived through it anyway. The soldier was killed the following day in fighting that claimed thousands of casualties on both sides, which is precisely the kind of detail that makes these stories difficult to dismiss as coincidence and equally difficult to treat as anything more than probability playing out across an army large enough that some fraction of anxious predictions were always going to prove correct. The most famous act of battlefield mercy in the entire war happened at Fredericksburg, in the aftermath of Burnside's disastrous assaults on Marye's Heights, and it involved a Confederate sergeant walking directly into a killing field for no reason connected to tactics or orders. Richard Kirkland, a South Carolina soldier stationed behind the stone wall that had shredded wave after wave of Union infantry, spent the night listening to wounded Union soldiers crying for water in the open ground below his position. By morning, unable to bear the sound any longer, Kirkland asked his commanding officer for permission to carry water out to the wounded men, fully exposed to Union fire the entire time. His officer warned him he would very likely be shot. Kirkland went anyway, collecting canteens from soldiers around him, climbing over the wall, and moving from one wounded Union soldier to the next for roughly an hour and a half, giving water, covering men with jackets, and adjusting the positions of soldiers in obvious pain. Union soldiers, watching from their own lines, close enough to have shot him easily, held their fire the entire time. Nobody ordered that restraint. It happened because enough individual Union soldiers, watching one man risk his life for their wounded comrades, independently decided not to kill him for it. Kirkland survived Fredericksburg and the act that would earn him the nickname the Angel of Mary's Heights among soldiers on both sides. But he did not survive the war. He was killed 9 months later at the Battle of Chickamauga, struck by Union fire while leading a charge, and died on the field far from the moment of mercy that had already made him something close to a legend among the men who witnessed it. His story circulated informally among soldiers for years before it was written down in any formal account, passed soldier to soldier as the kind of thing men needed to believe was possible even in the middle of a war built almost entirely around the opposite instinct. Sieges produced their own specific category of strange experience, driven by hunger extreme enough to change what soldiers considered edible. During the siege of Vicksburg in the summer of 1863, Confederate soldiers and civilians trapped inside the city were reduced to eating mule meat, then rats, which soldiers reportedly described as tasting similar to squirrel once a person's hunger had progressed far enough to stop caring about the difference. A local newspaper, still printing on wallpaper because regular paper had run out, published a recipe for mule meat soup during the siege's final weeks, treating the recommendation with a strange, forced normalcy that soldiers who lived through it later described as its own kind of surreal. Union soldiers besieging the city from outside dealt with a different but related strangeness, digging elaborate systems of trenches and bomb-proof shelters that some men decorated with makeshift furniture and personal touches, turning military engineering into something resembling underground housing while they waited for a city full of starving people to finally surrender. Civilians trapped inside Vicksburg developed their own strange adaptation to the siege, carving artificial caves directly into the hillsides surrounding the city to escape the constant Union artillery bombardment that made surface-level shelter dangerous around the clock. Entire families lived inside these hand-dug caves for weeks, furnishing them with rugs, furniture, and personal belongings carried down from their homes above, creating a genuine underground neighborhood that residents later described with a strange mixture of horror and something close to dark humor, given how quickly the arrangement became simply normal. Some families held dinner parties inside their caves, inviting neighbors sheltering in nearby caves of their own, treating the absurdity of formal social visits conducted underground during an active siege as one of the few ways left to maintain any sense of ordinary life while the ground shook overhead. At least a few hundred women fought in the Civil War disguised as men, and their stories only came to light through wounds, illness, or death that forced a physical examination revealing what their fellow soldiers had never suspected. Sarah Edmonds enlisted in a Michigan infantry regiment under the name Franklin Thompson, served for 2 years, including combat at Antietam and Fredericksburg, worked periodically as a regimental nurse and mail carrier, and eventually deserted rather than risk discovery when she fell seriously ill and feared a hospital examination would expose her. She wrote a memoir after the war, and decades later successfully petitioned Congress for a military pension, becoming one of the only women formally recognized by the United States government for Civil War combat service. Frances Clallan Clayton fought alongside her husband in a Missouri artillery unit under the name Jack Williams, reportedly smoking cigars and swearing convincingly enough that fellow soldiers never questioned her identity until after the war, when she came forward publicly with photographs taken in her soldier's uniform that still exists today. Historians estimate the true number of women who served this way likely exceeds what surviving records can confirm, simply because successful concealment meant by definition leaving no trace requiring correction. Weather itself became an enemy strange enough to kill soldiers who had survived direct combat without a scratch. At the Battle of Stones River in Tennessee, fought over the last days of December 1862 and into January 1863. Temperatures dropped low enough overnight that wounded soldiers who had survived the day's fighting froze to death on the field before anyone could reach them, their bodies found the next morning locked into the exact positions they had fallen in. Confederate and Union soldiers who marched through the same brutal winter conditions described entire columns of men whose beards and eyebrows filled with ice, whose feet went numb inside boots that had worn through months earlier, and whose officers sometimes lost more men to exposure during a single overnight march than they had lost in the battle preceding it. Soldiers who had enlisted expecting to die from a bullet found themselves instead genuinely afraid of falling asleep in the wrong place on a cold enough night. Winter camps produced their own bizarre spectacle, one that had nothing whatsoever to do with the enemy. Confederate soldiers stationed in winter quarters organized snowball battles on a scale that sounds more like folklore than documented military history, except that soldiers on both sides wrote detailed letters describing them. During one particularly cold stretch of camp life, thousands of Confederate soldiers organized formal mock battles, complete with officers directing movements, flags marking objectives, and entire brigades squaring off against each other in coordinated snowball assaults that soldiers described using the same tactical language they used for real combat. Men were injured seriously enough in these snowball fights to require medical attention, and at least one soldier's letter describes officers treating the mock battles with genuine seriousness, using them deliberately to keep bored, restless troops disciplined and occupied during the long stretches between actual engagements. It is one of the stranger images the war produced. Hardened veterans who had survived Antietam or Fredericksburg organizing themselves into formations to throw snow at each other with the same intensity they brought to combat. One particularly well-documented battle in Confederate winter quarters involved an estimated 9,000 soldiers organized into opposing divisions, complete with cavalry charges executed on foot and prisoners taken and formally paroled according to the same customs governing real prisoner exchanges. Generals reportedly rode out to observe, and at least one account describes an actual general getting pulled off his horse and stuffed face-first into a snowbank by his own troops. An indignity that would have been unthinkable in any real military context, but was apparently treated in the middle of a snowball war as entirely fair game. Families divided by the war produced some of its cruelest coincidences, and the most documented cases involved men discovering, sometimes only after a battle ended, that they had been fighting relatives on the opposing side. Mary Todd Lincoln, the president's own wife, had 4 brothers who fought for the Confederacy, one of whom died at the Battle of Baton Rouge, while Lincoln sat in the White House directing the Union war effort against the army his own brother-in-law served in. The Crittenden family produced 2 generals who ended up on opposite sides entirely, one Union and one Confederate, from the same household. Soldiers in border states like Kentucky and Missouri, where families frequently split along political rather than geographic lines, wrote letters describing the specific dread of advancing into battle, wondering whether a cousin, an uncle, or a brother might be standing in the opposing line. Documented cases exist of soldiers recognizing relatives among enemy prisoners taken after a battle, men who had grown up in the same house, discovering each other on opposite sides of a war neither had fully chosen for the same reasons. a 12-year-old boy became one of the war's strangest and most enduring legends by essentially refusing to go home when his family tried to send him there. John Clem ran away at age 9, hoping to enlist, and was turned down repeatedly for being too young. But he attached himself to a Michigan regiment as an unofficial drummer boy anyway, and the soldiers, apparently charmed by his persistence, unofficially adopted him and paid his wages themselves out of pocket. By the time he was 12, at the Battle of Chickamauga, in September 1863, Clem was riding an artillery caisson and reportedly shot a Confederate colonel who had demanded his surrender, an incident that turned him into a minor national celebrity known in newspapers as the Drummer Boy of Chickamauga. He was formally enlisted as a soldier shortly afterward despite his age, captured and later exchanged as a prisoner of war, and went on, remarkably, to an actual military career, eventually retiring from the United States Army decades later as a general, the last Civil War veteran still on active duty when he finally retired in 1915. What makes Clem's story land differently than most of the war's other strange episodes is the sheer span of it. A boy too young to legally enlist ended up serving under 9 different presidents over the course of a military career that stretched from muskets and cavalry charges into the era of machine guns and early aviation, a living bridge between the Civil War and a version of the United States Army that would have been unrecognizable to the soldiers who first paid his wages out of their own pockets because a 9-year-old refused to go home. He gave interviews late in life describing Chickamauga with a matter-of-fact tone that reporters found almost as strange as the story itself. A man in his 70s calmly recounting a childhood spent doing something no child should have been anywhere near. And then there were the moments that fit no clean category at all, the ones soldiers wrote home about, specifically because they knew nobody would believe them otherwise. At the Battle of the Crater outside Petersburg in July 1864, after Union engineers detonated 4 tons of gunpowder beneath Confederate lines, soldiers on both sides described the initial explosion sending entire sections of earth, cannon, and men into the air in a column visible for miles, followed by an eerie silence before the screaming started. Survivors described finding men from the Confederate defenses buried alive up to their necks in the crater's collapsed walls, some still breathing, some already dead, in scenes soldiers who had already witnessed years of conventional combat still described afterward as unlike anything else they saw in the entire war. These were men who had grown almost numb to ordinary violence by 1864, and even they came home from the crater changed by having seen something the rest of the war hadn't prepared them for. What followed the explosion made the entire episode stranger still. Union soldiers intended to advance around the crater's edges according to the original plan, instead poured directly down into the massive pit itself, drawn by the cover its steep walls seemed to offer, and quickly found themselves trapped in a hole 30 feet deep with no way to climb back out under fire. Confederate soldiers converged on the rim above and fired directly down into the packed mass of Union troops below, turning a feature meant to break their defensive line into a killing pit their own attackers had walked into voluntarily. Survivors described the fighting that followed as some of the closest and most desperate hand-to-hand combat of the entire war. Men jammed shoulder to shoulder in a crater never designed to hold that many bodies, unable to retreat, unable to advance, unable to do anything but fight or die in a hole in the ground that had been, only minutes earlier, solid Confederate earthworks. What ties every one of these stories together is not that they are unusual, though they certainly are. It is that they all happened to ordinary people who had no way of knowing, when they enlisted, what 4 years of war would actually ask of them. Nobody signs up expecting to trade coffee across a river with the men they are supposed to be killing, or to carry water to a dying enemy under fire, or to discover their own cousin standing in the opposing line. These moments happened because war, for all its organized violence and command structure and strategic planning, is ultimately experienced by individual human beings, making individual decisions in circumstances nobody trained them for. John Burns picked up a rifle because staying inside felt wrong to him. Richard Kirkland climbed over a wall because he couldn't listen to the crying anymore. Sarah Edmonds served for 2 years under a name that wasn't hers because the army she believed in wouldn't have taken her under her own. None of them were told to do any of this. They decided in the moment what kind of person they were going to be inside a war that gave most soldiers very little control over anything else. That is what makes these stories worth remembering beyond their strangeness. The Civil War is usually taught through maps, troop movements, and casualty totals, numbers large enough that the individual person inside them tends to disappear. But somewhere inside every one of those numbers was a man freezing to death in the exact position he fell, or a boy riding an artillery caisson at 12 years old, or 2 enemies holding fire because one of them had decided, for reasons that had nothing to do with orders, that this particular moment wasn't going to be about killing. The strangest experiences of the Civil War are strange precisely because they remind us that the people living through it were never simply soldiers. They were people first, doing whatever they could to hold on to that fact in circumstances that had been built, deliberately and systematically, to strip it away from them.